With the panel. Thank you again for such a phenomenal turnout for today's, for this evening's screening. And I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished group of panelists. So I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then we'll jump right into moderated discussion and then Q&A. So to my left is Ambassador Marybeth Leonard. She is the U.S. Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Ambassador Leonard was previously the representative of the United States to the African Union between 2016 to 2019, as well as a U.S. permanent representative to the UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNICA. She has served as a U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Mali, as well as an economic and consular officer in Yaoundé, Cameroon, Windhoek, Namibia, Lomé, Togo. She's also served as a political and economic officer in Cape Town, South Africa, and thereafter as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Suriname. To her left is Ben Oyokin, who is the Consul General of Nigeria in New York. Prior to this, he served as the Protocol Liaison Officer, as well as the Special Assistant to the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, positions he held since 2001. Previously, he served as the Protocol Liaison Officer to the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria from 2008 to 2010. Earlier in his service, he held posts in Bayelsa State, including the Chief of Protocol in the Government House from 2005 to 2007, and Head of Protocol to the Deputy Governor. And finally, to his left, Scott Eisner. He's the President of the U.S. Business Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He was also an officer at the Chamber, serving as the Senior President. Mr. Eisner represents the Chamber's interest in Africa through its U.S. African Business Center, the business community's leading advocacy group aimed at strengthening U.S.-African trade relations. He also directs the strategic activities of the Chamber as it engages with senior-level U.S. government officials, international business leaders, and African governments. We also, as you may have seen in the agenda, we had Charlotte Ashamu from the Smithsonian Museum of African Art. She was unfortunately unable to join us at the very last minute, but we'll all try to do our best without her. And in fact, what I was going to ask Charlotte to do is to give us a little bit of table setting about the Nollywood film industry. Scott's going to help us a little bit, and Ben on the economic side. But I just wanted to pivot from this movie, because I think that many of you may know that Nollywood is the second largest film industry by volume in the world. You may know how prolific this film industry is. Many films per week. In fact, there's a famous Nigerian producer known as Mr. Prolific. You know probably about the DVDs that are sold in Lekki and Wuse and Kano and Aba and Onisha. And you're thinking about Nollywood, maybe perhaps until this film is of sort of low production, limited plot. But because this film industry really connects with Nigerians, with themes of love and betrayal, themes about conflict and deception, and then as the movie showed, triumph, I think that many in the Nigerian film industry and the international community realize that this film industry has a lot more potential. And so we saw DSTV, MultiChoice, the South African firm, pick up many Nollywood films in its African Magic channels. We started to see the growth of African theater houses in Abuja, in Lagos, and other places where they're showing these films, and the emergence of what I think this film represents, which is the new Nigerian cinema, also known as New Nollywood. And you can see the quality of this film, the production value. I don't think Enugu's ever looked more attractive as a city. And this is why Netflix has picked up this movie and is now doing lots of content. This is why Canal Plus is looking for Nollywood films to put on its channels. This is why Star Times is looking at it. So today we're going to talk with our panel about its economic potential, and then we're going to talk a little about, as I alluded to in the beginning, about its soft power. So Scott, maybe I can start with you and just tell us a little bit about how the U.S. business community thinks about Nollywood in terms of its potential.
Yeah, thanks very much, Judd, and Your Excellencies, plural, both you on stage, and anyone who else thinks they're excellent in the audience. Thanks so much for coming tonight, because you all are. So in the context of Nollywood, I think there's three layers that we want to look at this engagement here. One of which is power of storytelling, power of diversity of thought, power of engagement. And I think that's really the driving force behind where the business community looks towards opportunities globally. It's that empowering factor that can lift lives up, that can actually drive new people's thinking and really break down a lot of those cultural barriers, whether you saw it in this one in the different states or you look across the United States, and how much that entertainment industry can drive communities into a place of mutual understanding. I think as business people, we begin to accept and really think forward-looking towards these ideas of incorporating multi-layer of thoughts. And when you bring together that culture that businesses strive to have, you really bring a better performance of your employees, you bring a better performance of life around you in this communal aspect. And so when you look at what the U.S. film industry in its own right has done over the years of building $43.4 billion of revenue over the years, Nollywood producing some 25,000 films, accounting at some point for 1.4% of Nigerian GDP. I mean, it's impossible not to see it as an intrinsic part of the value system that Nigeria offers. So I think when American businesses look at the economic landscape of Nigeria, it's not just the population base, it's the reality that it's breaking down barriers of connectivity. So when we watch a movie like the one we saw today, that it's no longer a foreign place to do business, it's just a place to do business. And I think that is really the power of Nollywood, as it gets escalated and builds up its repertoire of storytelling, of engagement. I mean, we just saw a film about business, told through the eyes of love, and strengthening, and really at the end of the day, empowerment of a woman to be the chief executive, a story that probably wouldn't have been told in a Nollywood film, or any American film for that matter, for years. And it's so great to see something like that, where you see really evolving thought around film is having continuity with where business is, and seeing that powerful woman come up at the end and say, this is my company and this is all of our companies, I think is where business is also looking today. So to give you some context around culture, that was a riff. I have no experience in the movie industry, so I don't know if that was helpful or not.
No, I think that's very helpful, and I don't know where our audience is on the camps of whether or not this film should have qualified for an Academy Award. I thought there was way more than 10 minutes of Igbo in there, but that was just to my ear. But I think the silver lining on this snub by the Academy Award is the profile this raised for this movie. And I wonder, Scott, or maybe Ambassador, if this gave Nollywood a little more of a push into the American business community or just the American psyche.
Yeah, 2 seconds. I mean, I was scrolling through the other night of just films in general, and it's amazing to see the diversity of films that are on Netflix and other panels. But I mean, so much density of African-made films now occur across the board. It really does bring a higher level of understanding. There was a terrifying fact that was put out by USC last year around the UNGA times, 2 years ago, that said 70% of portrayals of African writ large, poor choice of the continental approach to Africa, but 70% of all portrayals of Africans were gang-related or war-torn or some sort of violence-related thing. And I think we have to get to a point where that isn't the impression that Americans have of an entire continent, of millions of people, and I think the elevation of a film like this to international standards of elitism in a positive light is really changing the way that I know my business community sees the continent. Like I said, at the end of the day, it's just saying I'm doing business, with another business, not defining it by what it is any longer. And I think that's a really positive outcome.
Ambassador, did the Academy Awards and that whole controversy, did that change the way people talk to you about Nollywood or this film?
No, I mean, I would say, well, first of all, I've spent a whopping 3 months already in Nigeria, so so far I've spoken to one Nigerian filmmaker, in fact, Genevieve, because I knew that I was coming here. And of course, there was some disappointment behind it, but also she said that first of all, the notoriety that brought with it was fabulous for the movie. And she also had the feeling that the Academy was sort of thinking a little bit about what it is that they meant. It started life as a foreign language film category, and then they called it international films, and then disqualified this one for not being in foreign languages. And it's like, well, what do we mean? Do we mean foreign language films, or do we mean international films? She is, first of all, content with the publicity that came with that, and also that this is the film that she would have made, because this is the combination of languages in which the environment that she is depicting speaks. And so she's justifiably very proud of the product.
Good. Mr. CG, I'd like to ask you a question about what the Nigerian government is doing to promote Nollywood. There was a couple of really good speeches and presentations by senior ministers recently. How do you think about what are the challenges for this industry to grow? What can your government do to elevate it and create more jobs through it?
Thank you very much. Particularly the issue about access to finance is one of the basic issues for them. Then the issue about regulation, there's a lot of piracy in the industry, a lot are losing revenue in the product they have turned out to the market. So what government is trying to do, or we've been doing, is to strengthen the regulatory framework in existence, particularly the IP, which we are a part of it in some of the regulatory bodies for like the Nigerian Copyright Commission. Government continue to strengthen the enforcement mechanism. Then you also have the census board is there, then film and video census board. Then the aspect of protecting the economic rights of the filmmakers and even the moral rights is very important to them, because when they put so much in production of films, and if this industry is not protected, it will be a disincentive to those who will be creative. So government also have decided to create deliberate ways of encouraging funding windows. Government has been very supportive in that direction in terms of providing funds through the Bank of Industry in Nigeria, and also the central bank last year rolled out some form of creative industry fund for the industry, just to encourage them to put the value proposition to the growth of the industry. So there's so many other incentives that government is also encouraging based on the private sector. Partnership too is going on. Then also issues about co-production, in terms of treaty with the international community, so that they'll be able to do film production, maybe in US, going to even in Nigeria, so that they won't have those restrictions in terms of partnering with the international filmmakers, because they need to play big in a very qualitative way to be acceptable in the international market also.
Well, you're in New York, so it's a hub of creatives for US. What is the pitch that you give when you meet a US business person who's interested in teaming up with Nollywood? What's the selling point from your point of view, from your government's point of view?
Well, like what I've just said, there's a lot that they can invest in, particularly the issue about film production. So particularly the issue about creating laws. Like we are here now, like in a cinema setup, but this is what Nigeria really needs. This is open for business. Nigeria is having about 770 local government. If an investor is interested in investing in community cinemas alone, that is an area of great return on investment. Population of Nigeria is big. Nigeria is the destination where you are guaranteed with a return on investment. Apart from that, you also can invest in issues about building studios. You have some big studios in the international community. For example, in US, you have the Hollywood studio in LA, then Allmark, Universal Studio, and all of those studios. So in that way, you reduce the stress in producing films. There will be one-stop shop. They'll be able to get into a studio and get all that they need, and the time to produce the film will be reduced, the cost element and the quality will also be there. All those areas are also open for investment the aspect of distribution too is an issue. Channels of distribution are very competitive and it's not very structured. So those who invest in that area too will actually be growing the industry and be playing big in that direction too. Then we need to also think about infrastructure. The environment of doing that business is important. Some actually looking up to partner with big players in the area of infrastructural development in the film industry. So since it's a business, government cannot come into all of this area, but it's open for the market, for people to take advantage. And Nigeria is playing big in terms of there's a growing domestic market for film industry, and like what you have seen, the quality is there, and they've got the stories, and they have the talent, and just the other area I can mention quickly is also capacity building. People are beginning to open up, schools for this industry, and if you invest in it too, that is another area that the industry players will take advantage of. So these are some of the areas very open for business.
It's always a little awkward when we host these events because I'm not an econ guy, right? The econ stuff, you go to Scott, I think more about politics and foreign relations. And so I wanted to ask Ambassador Leonard to talk a little about the soft power of the Nigerian film industry. I think that it's still underexplored and underutilized by the Nigerian government. And then I think that there's some challenges for us to figure out how do we navigate into this space. So it would be wonderful, ma'am, to hear your thoughts on how do Nigerians benefit from Nollywood as a brand? How does the Nigerian government interact with it? And then what do US diplomats, US foreign policy practitioners think about how do we sort of work through it?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to observe that the reason I'm back in Washington this week is because we today had the Binational Commission, which is our formal check-in mechanism between the governments of the United States and Nigeria. And just so happened that the theme this year was innovation and ingenuity. If countries have personalities, I think you would say that the United States and Nigeria share those attributes. And so it's really delightful to see this film get picked up by Netflix and really further that partnership between the U.S. and the Nigerian film industry. It's a really good reason in particular to spur us on in our work on international and IPR protections, which is one of the work plans, if to get you into the wonky details of the BNC that we're working on. But something that's very important to make sure that people get to retain the value of their creative thought and work. But there really are ways to use the soft power that's associated with it. I mean, if you speak to Genevieve, when you ask her what she was trying to convey in this film, she talks about things like, well, first of all, the realities of women in the workplace, but also reminding Nigerians that the pot of gold is not only someplace else. There's magic at home, and that you can have creative things that are going on, diverse things. It's a powerful tool for social change. Even I mean, my own embassy, my predecessors, we have all kinds of relationships with American Film Showcase. We send people back and forth to collaborate on things. We sponsor or we are involved in some documentary film festivals that happen in Nigeria. And for example, we encouraged someone to make a documentary about the imam who protected hundreds of Christians during one of the recent attacks in recent years on religious grounds, and to just get that message out there. So it's a great tool for telling compelling stories. And so that particular movie was called Sowing Hope, if you haven't seen it. It's during the last crisis in Jos. So yeah, I mean, it's a vehicle to talk about the things that we together think are important. It's a vehicle for Nigerians to hear more about themselves. The film industry, once upon a time, a bunch of people grew up watching American films, and so do Nigerians maybe know more about American history than Nigerian history, and how is this an element of identity and pride and nation building? It's very special.
And I mean, these films, not only are they available on streaming services, but Nollywood films are often dubbed in French dubbed in Lingala. I mean, the Nigerians are, I think, defining a big part of African culture because they're the first foot forward. The South Africans may have something to quibble about that, but I think it is true that Nigerians are often an American's first interaction with with an African on the screen. You said something, ma'am, about messages, and for me, not only is this movie enjoyable, funny, we had a couple of good responses from the audience, but this message at the end really resonated to me because Lionheart, this southeastern company, predominantly Igbo company, the way it solved its problem was in a partnership with the North.
Yep.
And it wasn't on the nose, right? Like they didn't hit you, but I've always thought that when Nigeria is struggling to address a problem, it is when there is this cross-ethnic, cross-regional, cross-religious sort of relationship that is built. And I think Ada says it in the film, we have the same values. And so I don't know if Genevieve mentioned that, but I was really struck by what an important message for Nigeria that was, and how it wasn't preachy, it wasn't sort of overdone, but it just sort of, you walked away with a really sense of a unified Nigeria.
Indeed.
Okay, good.
Well said.
Yes. So what we're going to do is we are mindful of your time because you've been with us since 4 o'clock, but we do want to open up for a little Q&A for our panelists. So my team has got mics, and if you just want to raise your hands, and then we will turn to a couple of Q&A. So in the front, right here, Marielle. And if you could just stand up and introduce yourself. I think it's really important always to say here, these are questions, so they have to end with a question mark.
They're not all questions, because those of us who are experts in this field don't have to ask questions, although I may have a question, but it's rhetorical. I'm pleased the ambassador is here, and of course, the ambassador from New York, but I would have liked more representation from Africans who know what's going on. Because for instance, Nollywood is not new. And secondly, Lionheart is not the first Netflix. There was Wedding Party. You all know about the Wedding Party movie. Yeah, so 2016, Nollywood was 2018. So, you know what you're talking about in terms of investments. There's an element to it on youth, using, capitalizing on the high unemployment rate. That's my question to the Nigerian ambassador. What incentives can the Nigerian government give to Nollywood to maybe hire more youth, or maybe expand the horizon for others to participate? You mentioned training, capacity. We don't need capacity building. Come on now, in acting. That's, Nigeria is number 2 behind Bollywood. Itself, okay. Yeah, so that's not an issue. So with regard to youth, please comment on that, the incentives that can be provided to Nollywood to do that. And secondly, on the IP, how do we deal with the devaluing of the actresses? I don't know, it's linked to the IP question, which the ambassador alluded to, and I think you did, both ambassadors alluded to. Because I checked Genevieve, who's the most popular, she's like the Julia Roberts. Those of you who are young probably don't know the Julia Roberts of Nigeria, so to speak. She's worth only 6 million, 7 million. Julia Roberts is worth over 100 million, right? So how do we start valuing, I know it's linked to the IP and others, but how do we, change that dynamics for the average or the best so-called Nigerian actress to be more competitive, bearing in mind the difference in value, Naira versus dollars or whatever?
Sir, may I turn to you to answer that question?
Well, thank you very much. In fact, as a government, what we need to do is to create the environment conducive for these talents to come out. You have said they don't need training. So once the environment is right, the youth can come into the industry. The aspect of CBN intervention fund we talk about is that creative finance industry. So it's targeted at the youth, the talented ones. So the corporate financing option may not be very good for them because of collateral requirement and all of that. So it is structured in such a way that it is easy, for the industry to access it. So in the past, certain funds, particularly in the aspect of a bank of industry, the fund was there, but some people were unable to access it, but because of the conditions attached to it. But the government began to review all of these things and bring it, lower in interest, so that it becomes easier for people to access. So improving the environment can solve that issue. The same thing about the value. Government may not, be involved with so much in terms of interacting with them on what to do, but what do we need to do to empower them, to create the environment necessary for them to operate? I think that's what we can do to achieve this purpose.
Scott?
Yeah, I think touching on the value of someone's wealth, the reality is this piracy issue is a huge issue, right? It's what drives or crushes industries globally. In the US alone, Chamber came out with a report recently that said US film and television makers lose at least $29.2 billion a year on global piracy. If you look at that, it's a $45 billion industry, that's more than half its worth on an annual basis. And I think that gets to the heart of the question. One is, there's plenty of opportunities for youth in the Nollywood industry or any global film industry because it's got to be the key grips. It's the kids running back and forth with meals, doing craft services. I mean, it is his own self-contained environment, but you can't pay for them on goodwill and hope, right? So you really have, as government, have to figure out ways to crack down on the online piracy, on the protection of those copyrights, because without it, your industry craters. You can have every incentive on earth, you can have every tax scheme on earth, but if you can't create a consistent revenue stream, you can't go to a Zenith Bank or others to help finance it. You can't go to those independent television producers to help finance it. Now that somehow gets overtaken to some degree by streaming licensees and others because it does then filter out into the internet. But to your point, you want to know what's better? Tell everyone that goes out to the market and gets a knockoff film to stop buying it. Tell every kid who's online to stop watching that film. It'll help her reach that Julia Roberts feat in no time. But until you can knock down the piracy issue, you can't grow an industry, and that's true of everything on earth.
Pastor, do you have any comments, or would you like to go to Q&A?
Nope, we can go to another question.
All right, why don't we go to another question? Sir?
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to sound more like a contrarian here. The Nigerian entertainment industry, including the film industry in Nigeria, is thriving not because of the Nigerian government. I know that we all say government should be involved in facilitating, creating the environment for these things to continue to thrive. But my fear is that anything Nigerian government touches goes bad. And I would want to say, yes, I think there should be a balance to it. But, by and large, my sentiment will be the less the Nigerian government gets involved with the entertainment industry, the better. I think that is why that is probably the most creative aspect of Nigeria today. And the reason why they are there is because the government has not really made a whole lot of intrusion into it. So I would say, yes, let the Nigerian government continue to create that environment, but my other feeling is let them just have minimal input into how that.
Sir, do you have a question for the
That's
panel?
my comment.
That's your point. Okay, maybe we'll have a question in the back.
Hi, everybody. Bumi, I work for Chevron. Thank you to Judd and the great team for putting this up. Ambassador, nice to meet you again. Thank you, Scott. I think my question is really for Scott. A lot of us know that the way movies are measured out here is success at the box office. A lot of your international movies that are made here get into Africa, not only Nigeria, other countries. So what would you say is the opportunity for Nollywood and African movies to get into your theaters here, if at all there's an opportunity? And what should Nigerian filmmakers be focused on, to make their films are entertaining, or no, the word is not entertaining, to make people want to come see their movies if they're here in your box office and your theaters?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think part of it is just cultural awareness, and this is a really kind of blanket statement that Americans in general are fairly naive towards Africa in general, and we know this from a series of data. So I think it's figuring out ways to get in front of movie houses. We all rely on studios to look at the arc of a film's life, whether it starts at a lot, ends up in a theater, and ends up in a Blu-ray stuck on a shelf somewhere for the rest of our lives. But it's really trying to figure out innovative ways to look at some regional micro theaters around the country, or even some of the larger chains, which have been acquired by studios around the world, whether it's Chinese companies or whatnot, but really finding opportunities to do festivals around the excellence of African and Nigerian and specific Nollywood productions. I don't see that happening a lot throughout the United States. It probably does happen in markets where there's heavy Nigerian populations, because you can bank on people attending it, but getting beyond those, so working with consul generals throughout the United States to do these types of, as the ambassador pointed out, they do this in the embassy in Nigeria. So how do we get that done around the United States, and how do we bring the level of attention up? But I think the storylines of humanity are what plays these days. I think the storyline of Lionheart, of perseverance, of making mistakes, of owning up to your liabilities of life, how we're all fallible, and how we can achieve something, are things that we all embrace these days. We're in a tough environment globally these days, whether it's viruses or politically. Like, we're in a weird place as a global community. So finding stories that draw our emotions out are the places that I would invest money in if I were looking at a Nollywood film, or any film that is. I don't need to invest in another cops and robbers movie. I've seen 1,000 of those, but I do want to see stories of how human lives interact, and I think that's why, and a lot of Nollywood does draw on that. So I think there's an opportunity here to take a story and change the way we all view each other, which is really, I think, the objective of film from its roots, is changing perspectives across the board and making us all feel like we're, for at least a short period of time, part of a community. I mean, we saw that outpouring around the tragedy of Kobe Bryant's and the other lives that are lost. Like, for a moment in time, no one in the world looked at their skin or looked at their checkbooks to understood where they sat in society. They were all affected greatly. And that's kind of the equalizer of the movie industry, right? You can sit in an audience of people you've never seen before, and you're all equal for that, hour and a half or whatever it was today. So I think that's how I look at it.
Pastor, any thoughts on how to get Nollywood films into the U.S. theaters?
Well, I think that the attention over the Oscar thing is a great one. I mean, that people be, even if it didn't end up as a nominee, that is for U.S. film as for any other film, that is a way to draw attention to something, that there is a film that is worthy of that caliber, that is worthy of that attention, and indeed, to get it out through the Nigerian government's own efforts here in the United States. I think that there is an appetite for, I'm an Africanist, so I think this is great. I would go to see this in the movie theater in a heartbeat. But as again, they are universal themes, and so just to get the word out there about the fabulous quality and the interesting and engaging stories.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Parasite, the South Korean film, in a theater here. I would see Lionheart, and I think we hopefully will have a Korea series on literature, but if you look at the way Nigerian literature is dabbling in thrillers, in science fiction, I think there's going to be some really unique Nigerian stories that will translate really well into film that will be appealing to a specific audience. I would also say that theaters in Maryland, I've been to many Nollywood festivals here in Maryland because of a large Nigerian population. Let's hear another round of questions. Oh, now we have a lot.
Wow.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to take a group. This is really critical that it's a question, not a point. So why don't we do the two folks there, and then we'll come back to this side for the last round of questions.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim Gumel. I have a question, but I'll make a comment first.
I don't think that was part of the equation.
No. So part of the message that Lionheart was trying to portray was captured perfectly. I think it's unity, because some of you that know about Nigeria would know that there is a lot of friction between the southeast, the north, the southwest, but to be honest, this movie shows that there is a chance for unity, and that there is greatness in unity. And there is also something that not many Nollywood movies do, which is portray Northerners as successful people. They usually show them as security or guardmen in their movies with very poor accent, very poor English. But this movie didn't do that. they kind of upgraded, or rather they show that yes, in every society they are different, they are rich, they are poor, so they did that well, which I think Genevieve should be commended for doing that. So my question is, my first question is, what effort, what effort is the Nigerian government, the Consul General and the Ambassador also, what efforts are they, practical efforts are they making to bring attention to the Nigerian movie industry here in the US and back in Nigeria? The Nigerian part is because the Nollywood is just, there is Kannywood also, for some of you that maybe know a bit about Nigerian film industry, which also is equally big, but nobody knows about that. So is there a practical effort that the embassy is doing to highlight Kannywood also as part of Nollywood? And the Nigerian government here, is there any effort to have events and maybe screenings like this where people will be invited and such discussions can happen so that business leaders eventually will catch up and investment will later flow? Are there any efforts for something like that to be done?
Great, and then there was someone sitting right next to you that asked for a question too, yes?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Saadatu Hamu. I'm an LLM candidate at Georgetown University. My question is to Your Excellency. I'm really pleased to hear that the theme for the BNC meeting is on innovation and ingenuity. My question is, how do we ensure that this conversation on innovation is inclusive of those who are driving innovation in Nigeria? So I'm
sorry, could you repeat that last
How
part?
do we ensure that this conversations and collaborations on innovation in Nigeria between the US and Nigeria is inclusive of those who are driving innovation in the country? And in particular, I'm referencing the startups who leverage on technology and also the investors who go back to Nigeria from here to invest in Nigerian companies. How do we also ensure that beyond accessing US funding in these startups, we're able to retain those intellectual property rights in Nigeria? Because I find it will be really hard to decide, for government to decide what happens on companies if the startups that are driving these innovations are not even part of this conversation. So my question is, how do we ensure that it's a collaborative conversation?
So we have, I think,
Her
two questions
Excellency.
for you, Ambassador.
My question is to the ambassador.
Okay. So we have two questions for you, Ambassador, and one question for you, Mr. CG.
Thank you very much. Let me correct an impression. You know, particularly the industry in Kano you're referring to. Governments don't discriminate in that wise. The CBN Intervention Fund, if you look at it, the title is Creative Financing Industry. It's not Nollywood, it doesn't call it that way. So it's for all. So that takes care of that aspect of it. So there's no discrimination in that aspect, even though our friends said we should not be involved in, you know, government should not be involved, but you can't do without the government, you know, at different level. Whether I want to do business or your private life, government need to protect your, you know, your life and property and all of that. So it's part of the issues we have. We need to know what we want really and partner with government, you know, to better the society. So sometimes government don't have all the answers to issues. Individuals need to, you know, be supportive to what government is doing. So the other issue will be the aspect of what do we do to encourage, you know, organize this kind of gathering to create awareness. Yes, that is something we do constantly. I can give you an example. My last post was in Geneva. I was in, my desk was intellectual property organization, and part of it was, I was encouraging the screening of Nigerian film. The last one I did was The CEO by Kunle, you know, so that's what we do. in terms of what they need, regulatory issues. We stimulate discussions on the awareness for them to know their rights in the industry and see what we can do to strengthen the enforcement mechanism back home. So those are the things that can actually encourage and make them know that government is concerned about what they are doing and ready to protect and support them. So it's a constant thing. Even in New York, I've done it several times in New York. Last year, we also went to LA. There was a Nollywood in Hollywood. So we were also represented. All these are to encourage the activities of this film industry. Thank you.
I would say, first of all, well, indeed, I mean, IPR is inherently a government function, so there you are. I think if you're going to protect that, we're going to have to go that way. But I think further to and I'm not still quite sure, I've gotten the question on the inclusivity, but I would say that we're trying very hard to connect U.S. and Nigerian filmmakers. The American Film Showcase is a collaboration between the State Department and the University of California School of Cinematic Arts. We send filmmakers there to learn their craft. We bring U.S. filmmakers to do masterclass workshops at the Nigerian Film Institutes in Abuja, and Lagos, and Jos, and participate in film festivals. And I think that there is something to be said for bringing creative people from two different nations together and having a cross-pollination on how they might work together and how they give each other access to the resources and to the minds of the industry on the other side. So I think that's something that organically grows into more of a American filmmaker appreciation for what's going on in Nollywood that begins to drill into the reception that Nigerian films get in the United States. If cool American filmmaker says they need to be working with cool Nigerian filmmaker, this person, that's going to go somewhere and bring it into a more global perspective.
We'll do a last round of questions. Sir, you've been patient, and then a man behind you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Thank you, Judd, Scott, and Mr. Ambassador. Well, I think the gentleman here started with precepts and then questions, so I'm just going to drop a few comments and then questions. My first comment is the security situation in Nigeria. It's what it is. It's very complicated right now. And my first question will be to the to the ambassador, Nigerian ambassador from New York. We get this as Nigerian Americans who are partially based here and then with a lot of time in and out of Nigeria. We know the hassles that we have to go through to take an American business or an American company, an American investor to Nigeria. Last year, I had to do almost a year-long project in Nigeria, and the University of Southern California, as was mentioned here, was actually going to send a film crew with me for the project that I was going to do in Nigeria, but they read the security reports and backed up. And so we know that this situation is complicated, and the impression that I think the rest of the world, well, certainly Nigerians are getting, the rest of the world eventually catch up to it, is that there seems to be an unwillingness or sort of like being tone deaf to the security situation by the current government. I don't know who's going to take a movie theater to Sambisa Forest, and I get that perhaps nobody's telling the president or the current regime what the true situation is, because there's nothing, no body language, no political will has been displayed that it is important for the government to address security. Because Nigerians, I imagine that in the future, the biggest export in Nigeria is going to be arts and culture, such as Nollywood.
So, sir, I'm going to be mindful of everyone's time. What is your question?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, what is the plan for security? And that's for the gentleman, Mr. Ambassador. And then a different question for Madam Ambassador. Let me just box it in so everybody takes their notes at this time. So, Madam Ambassador, we read very unflattering reports about Nigeria, and it's going to be under your watch very soon. Now, we know that southern Nigeria is totally different from northern Nigeria in terms of, how cosmopolitan and how perhaps in tune with U.S. values that northern Nigeria is.
I think Kanawha people would disagree with you, sir, but go ahead.
But when these reports come as one report from Nigeria. And so no investor is an investor who is not going to go to Sambisa Forest doesn't know that he could come to Lagos and do business. Thank you very much.
Okay, and ma'am, Mario, right next to you. That'll be our last question.
My name is Francisco. I'm from the Ballard Group. I would like to start with a compliment, since I'm the last questioner, to Judd, to thank him for organizing this whole series. It's very long overdue in Washington, and I think the private sector, frankly, can do a lot more in this than the government can. We have more resources. Secondly, The Wedding Party was the first great movie out of Nigeria. I know the lady that sang that great song. Last time I was in Nigeria, I spent a lot of time with her. There's a lot of very deep pockets who are very interested in Africa and in culture right now. I'm thinking of Amazon, Google, Apple, even Jack Dorsey has announced that he's going to go live in Africa. They should be, it seems to me, tapped for what we're talking about here. And do you know if anybody has or what their plans are, particularly, several of them own production companies and do streaming. Has anybody approached them for working with Nollywood and with the great, frankly, cinema industry in Senegal, which is where I used to live, and it has a very great award-winning cinema as well. Have they expressed any interest in that? I've seen them mainly talk about improving Wi-Fi and things like that, so I'd be interested in that. They have deep pockets, very.
Thank you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn to Scott. We'll walk back and end with the ambassador, but if you have response to any of those questions or you have parting shots.
Yeah, no, I'm thankful no one asked me any parting questions. That's awesome. Yeah, I would just say, look, I think the best thing that I've seen happen is around elevating through, you got to know who your audience is at the end of the day when it comes to trying to get a movie made. I happen to be in an industry, I used to work in the boxing industry for Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis wasn't going to be a heavyweight champion if he didn't understand that the burden of his success of his career as a boxer were on his shoulders, and that's true of the movie industry as well. So I think finding creative partnerships that are outside of the box of our traditional thinking of how films will get made. Justin Bieber wouldn't have been Justin Bieber if Usher hadn't seen him on YouTube. So we have to start thinking unorthodox perceptions of how we might engage here. So going out to Hollywood and finding out, whether it's a Will Smith or a Julia Roberts, how do you get them on Team Nollywood early on in this process of development? So getting those folks that are going to back your movie project early on, whether it's through creative licensing agreements, points on the back end of deals long term, or if it's going to banks that are willing to underwrite it because they understand the exposure and the risk within the Nollywood framework, whether it's on security or immigration or any topic of the day. But I think what I would say to anyone in this room that's interested in the creative industry is push your government to protect IPR, push your government to give you tax incentives. That's the burden is on them. Outside of that, government should generally stay away from trying to instruct how a film should be made. I have never seen a good film or a good advertisement be made by government. So that would be one, and then be creative. Figure out the unorthodox. I mean, if you're in the movie industry in Nollywood, you should be sending every Hollywood big wig or small wig or whatever wig they might wear your video on a daily basis and annoy the hell out of them until the point where they have to respond. Persistence is key in the movie industry. I happen to grow up around it, so you won't get your voice out there unless you're your own major champion. So act like you're the heavyweight champion of the world, and you'll probably figure out a success. And hopefully government will encourage you but not block you in that process.
Consul General, let me turn to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that question. In fact, the issue about security is global, particularly terrorism issues, and it's being discussed in different fora. And I'm happy the ambassador who's in Nigeria is also here. Sometimes these things are blown out of proportion. Nigeria is living a normal life. Some people are, in some aspects, is having issue, can't deny that fact. But government is engaging on a daily basis and looking for different ways and means, of solving the problems. We're in BNC, those are some of the discussion too, So it is, government is not just folding hands in the concerns you are raising. So it is important also for you to begin to appreciate movies like this. You know, Nollywood is telling a better story of Nigeria, you know, and they are beginning to document for us, you know, what others cannot tell us. We need to appreciate what we have. Sometimes, you know, imagining that all is bad is always a very not good, too good for us, you know. And particularly if you don't see things yourself, you might not appreciate what is actually happening back home. I will encourage you sometimes to visit home and to see, you know, the same country others are criticizing, the richest man in Africa is still there doing his businesses, and so many other things are there. So I always travel there. You know, Ambassador just came back from Nigeria. That is not to say there are no issues, but government is also not relaxed. But Nigeria is safe, government is engaging, the world is also concerned about security generally anywhere, any day, anytime. So it is important, you know, government is not relaxed, and if there's anything you too can do to solve the problem, why not come up also? You know, it is very important for us to address this together. Thank you very much.
Ambassador.
To start with Ambassador Cook's question, I mean, I think that's a fabulous point, and that the tech sector, the American tech sector is present in an increasing way in Nigeria. And yes, they have started looking first at technology, but then isn't the link with Netflix quite interesting? Because that's someplace that begins to merge those two worlds and perhaps brings the people together to think of the next logical conclusion. Over the course of my Foreign Service career, there are many instances in which people are unhappy with the system of travel advisories and warnings about talking about our faithful assessment of what it's like to be in a place, and our considered advice to Americans. Fortunately, I don't believe that we've ever aspired to include an assessment of the relative cosmopolitan nature of different towns in a given country. You know, we provide information. People make their decisions, and that's our obligation to our citizens to do. I think, you know, getting back to the question we had earlier about how does Nigeria capture the American popular imagination? You know, I'm a lucky girl. I get to live in Nigeria, which has this rich culture. It has fabulous music. It has fabulous writers. It has, you know, they have this burgeoning film industry. And the film industry is not the only one that's crossing. You know, the musicians are getting there too. When you've got Burna Boy hanging out on all three of the late night shows, you know, you begin to give Americans a sense that this is a place with things that are happening. And I think it increases the receptiveness to other cultural channels coming through. So I'm a lucky girl to live in Nigeria and get to witness this firsthand. And hopefully more and more Americans will realize how lucky they could be to listen to it in their own homes and see it.
Well, we're going to do our part in trying to help bridge the gap between both the American public, the American foreign policy community, and the Nigerian and African creative industry. So as I said at the outset, this is the start of our creative series. We have events lined up throughout the year where we'll talk about TV, talk about music, we'll talk about fashion. So I hope you'll join the conversation. And let me give a round of applause to my panelists.
Well done.
Now we have a small reception if you're interested in a few beverages and snacks. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Judd.
Let me find my thing in my